It's amazing how one story, out of all the headlines, can really make you stop and think about, like, how our government actually works and, more importantly, how their decisions impact real people, right?
Absolutely.
So this week, it was a federal judge stepping in to stop these sudden firings of, like, thousands of federal employees. And it just got me thinking, about fairness, about the limits of power. It's a fascinating case.
Yeah, it really is. It's, not just about personnel. It's a deep dive into a pretty significant ruling.
Yeah.
A federal judge in California ruled the Trump administration basically illegally fired a whole bunch of federal employees, probationary employees.
Right.
And so we're going to try to figure this out. Why the judge make this ruling? What does it mean for the employees? And really, what does this tell us about how the different parts of our government, work together or sometimes don't?
Yeah, and to kind of break this down, we've been looking at a transcript of a recent YouTube discussion by Glenn Kirshner.
Okay.
And he's a former federal prosecutor.
Yeah.
And he brings, like, a really interesting legal perspective to all of this. So our goal here is to kind of get past all the legal jargon, right?
Right.
And just figure out, like, what happened, why does it matter, and what might be coming next.
So let's start with the actual firings themselves.
Okay.
Can you kind of set the scene? Like, how did this all go down?
Yeah, it sounds like it was really sudden and unsettling, especially for these employees, right?
Right.
The directive came down on Friday, February 14th.
Oh, wow. Valentine's Day.
Yeah, Valentine's Day, to let all these people go.
Oh.
And then they had to have it all done by the end of Monday, February 17th.
So basically a weekend.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Talk about a way to ruin your Valentine's weekend.
Right.
So it was incredibly fast.
An incredibly tight turnaround. And we're talking about thousands of federal employees.
Yeah, thousands.
These aren't long-term, employees. These are relatively new hires. They're on what's called probationary status. So these are people who are in their first year or two of federal employment.
Right.
I mean, can you imagine just getting that news and having a weekend to figure out what you're going to do?
And just the sheer number, right? The source really emphasized thousands. And these are people who are just starting out their careers in public service. I mean, they could be in so many different roles that are important to keeping the government running.
Absolutely.
And there's an actual OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, a memo dated that Friday saying everybody's got to be gone by Monday.
Wow.
It felt chaotic, and the source used the words callous and cruel, and I think that's pretty accurate.
Well, and it raises so many questions about, due process, basic fairness for employees. Even if they're on probationary status, there are rules, there are norms, there are procedures.
Yeah.
And to do it so abruptly, I mean, you got to wonder what that does to morale in those agencies, what it does to efficiency. I mean, it sends a shockwave through the system.
So then we have this judge who steps in, right?
Right.
Tell us about Judge Alsup's ruling here.
So U.S. District Judge William Alsup in San Francisco, he reviewed everything and basically said, you can't do that. These firings were illegal, and he actually stopped them.
Okay.
He issued what's called a temporary restraining order after a hearing that happened on Thursday. So it's like a legal stop sign.
Okay.
At least for now.
So temporary restraining order. So that puts everything on hold.
It puts a pause on the firings. And it's not for the whole federal government. Yeah. It's just the agencies where the firings would impact the groups that sued, the civic organizations that sued the Trump administration.
Oh, okay.
So we're talking Department of Veterans Affairs, the National Park Service, the Small Business Administration, Bureau of Land Management, even the Department of Defense, Fish and Wildlife Services. That's a lot of agencies.
That's huge, yeah. And it sounds like Judge Alsup really had some strong feelings about this whole thing. There's a quote that really stuck out. He said, "How could so much of the workforce be amputated suddenly overnight? It's so irregular and widespread, so aberrant in the history of the country." I mean, that's not the kind of language you hear every day from a federal judge.
No, it's a really pointed statement. It's unusual. It really highlights, what he saw as the damage from this kind of mass firing.
Right.
It makes you wonder, were the right procedures followed? Was there a solid reason? And honestly, could this kind of thing destabilize the whole civil service?
Okay, so we have the judge basically hitting the pause button on these firings.
Right.
But this can't be the end of the story, right?
Not at all, not at all. Judge Alsup scheduled another hearing. It's coming up in 2 weeks. And this is where things get really interesting. He specifically asked to hear from some key people. Charles Eisel, He was acting director of OPM when this all happened, and also leaders from some of those agencies we talked about. So he wants to get to the bottom of this.
So he wants to hear it straight from the people who were in charge of this, the people who actually made the decision, people who carried it out.
Right.
And the source even pointed out that the judge is requiring these Trump administration officials to show up and answer questions.
Right.
It's pretty direct, right?
Yeah, it is. It suggests that he's not taking this lightly. He wants to know what were the motivations here? What was the legal basis for doing this? And I wouldn't be surprised if the Trump administration pushes back. They might appeal to a higher court. It could even go all the way to the Supreme Court.
Right. Because we've seen these kinds of legal battles play out before. The source even mentioned a recent case where the Supreme Court actually temporarily blocked a lower court order about funding for U.S. aid organizations. They even mentioned Chief Justice Roberts. So it seems like the Supreme Court's willing to weigh in on disputes, when it comes to the Trump administration.
It's true. But it's important to remember every case is different.
Right.
We can't predict what the Supreme Court would do.
Right.
But it is a reminder that they are keeping an eye on things.
Okay, so we have a judge who says these firings are likely illegal.
Right.
We have potential appeals coming up, maybe even a Supreme Court decision. But what if in the meantime, the administration just doesn't do what the judge said? Who actually makes them comply?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Who actually enforces these orders?
Yeah.
That's where we get into the whole rule of law. A court issues an order, so then what?
Right.
What guarantees it will be followed? And that takes us to Title 28, Section 566 of the United States Code, the rule book for the whole federal legal system.
Okay, so what does that section say?
Well, subsection A is really clear.
Okay.
It lays out the job of the U.S. Marshal Service. And it says, and I'm quoting here, that they are responsible to provide for the security and to obey, execute, and enforce all orders of the United States District Courts.
So that's pretty clear. The U.S. Marshal Service is who makes sure federal court orders actually happen.
Exactly. And subsection C goes even further.
Okay.
It says the marshals shall execute all lawful writs, process, and orders issued under authority of the United States. That includes these orders from Judge Alsup, right?
Right.
And get this, it says, and shall command all necessary assistance to execute its duties. So they not only have to act, they can get help if they need it.
So it's pretty straightforward. The law says shall execute. There's not a lot of wiggle room there. And the source really made it clear there's no escape clause for the executive branch. Even if they don't like the court order, they still have to follow it.
That's a key point. The U.S. Marshal Service is part of the Department of Justice.
Right.
Which is part of the executive branch.
Right.
But their duty is to the courts. They have to enforce those orders no matter what. It's like a fundamental part of how our system is supposed to work.
And, Glenn Kirshner, who we're learning all this from, he actually was a federal prosecutor.
Oh, interesting.
So he's seen this up close. And he said, the U.S. Marshals are serious about this.
Yeah.
They do their job. He even said something like, U.S. Marshals always get their man or woman, emphasizing that commitment to following the law, to carrying out these court orders.
Yeah, getting that kind of firsthand perspective from someone who's been in the system, it really adds to the weight of this.
Right.
It makes it feel more real. Like, okay, this isn't just an academic discussion. This is how things work in the real world.
And so you have to wonder, what does this all mean going forward? The source mentioned that they're going to talk to a retired U.S. Deputy Marshal, Art Roderick,
Oh, interesting.
to get his perspective on all of this.
Yeah.
The marshals, the courts, the Department of Justice, and it really gets you thinking.
Yeah.
What if the administration really digs in their heels and resists this? Like, how would that even work?
It'd be uncharted territory.
Yeah. Like, can you imagine the marshals having to go to the White House and enforce a court order?
I mean, it sounds like a movie plot, but
Right.
it's a possibility. It makes you think about, how strong are the checks and balances in our system? How much power does the judiciary really have?
So to sum it all up,
Yeah.
we've got a federal judge who says these mass firings of all these federal employees, thousands of them, were illegal.
Right.
At least for now, everything's on hold.
Right.
We could have appeals coming up. We might even see the Supreme Court get involved.
Absolutely.
But the biggest question is, how do you actually enforce these court orders?
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to the executive branch. And it's a really important question, right? Because that's at the heart of how our system is supposed to function.
Yeah, this whole situation really shines a light on the role of an independent judiciary. The fact that they can hold other parts of the government accountable.
Right.
And it shows us the mechanisms that exist to make sure the rule of law is upheld.
Exactly. And that brings us to something to really think about, right?
Okay.
Given that the U.S. Marshals have